Okay, so let's get into it. For this deep dive, we're unpacking some material that looks at anti-Black racism, or SAR.
Systemic anti-Black racism.
Right. And the argument here is that it's not just, a collection of isolated prejudices. It's framed as this persistent, almost adaptable global operating system.
That's the perfect way to put it. It's the core definition. The sources use this iceberg analogy, which I think is really useful. The overt racism you see, the slurs, the explicit bias, that's just the tip. SAR is the massive, unseen base of that iceberg. It's all the norms, the policies, the institutions that hold the whole thing up.
And if we're going with that architecture analogy, this wasn't some kind of accident, was it? The material is pretty clear on that.
Not at all. Not even close. The sources argue that this racial hierarchy with Black people at the bottom was an intentional global market mechanism. It's foundational to what scholars call racial capitalism.
So profit and markets were literally built on top of this hierarchy.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating, I think, is how the research corrects the timeline. We all tend to focus on 1619 in North America.
It's the date everyone knows.
Right. But this template was set much, much earlier. Scholars estimate something like 156,000 Africans arrived in Iberia and the Atlantic Islands between 1441 and 1521.
Wow, that is way earlier.
It was transnational from the very beginning. So that complicates this idea of it being a uniquely American problem. It forces you to see it as a global system from its inception.
And this foundation is maintained today through a kind of institutional denial. The sources call it national amnesia.
A perfect term for it. Look at Canada. The national story is all about the Underground Railroad, being a liberator.
Sure.
But that story systematically overlooks Canada's own deep role as a perpetrator in the Atlantic slave economy after 1500. And that selective memory stops nations from connecting the dots between that history and today's outcomes.
Okay, so that's the history. Let's pivot to today. How does this operating system still run, especially in, say, the global north, where we have anti-discrimination laws?
Because the laws address the surface, the tip of the iceberg, not the foundation. And the hard data here is just, it's staggering. Field experiments across Western countries show non-white applicants get about 50% fewer callbacks.
50% for similarly qualified candidates.
Yes. The system is great at outlawing overt individual prejudice, but it fails to touch the foundational architecture. Things like old housing covenants, zoning laws, how schools are funded. Those things limit opportunities long before a resume even gets seen.
It's a structural filter. Now, if we look at Latin America and the Caribbean, the material says the mechanism shifts a bit to something called colorism.
Exactly. It becomes a color continuum model.
Yeah.
Resources, social capital, they're allocated based on your proximity to whiteness. It's prejudice based on skin shading.
Right.
And the consequences are lethal.
How so?
In Ecuador, for example, the maternal mortality rate for Afro-descendant women is triple the overall national rate.
Triple. That's a catastrophic failure of the public health system.
It's a structural failure, plain and simple. And we see another adaptation when we pivot to the Middle East and North Africa. There, the material points to cultural racism, like the use of the derogatory term abde, which creates the moral preconditioning for severe economic violence.
And that leads to something like the kafala system.
It's the clearest structural parallel to historical servitude. Kafala is a sponsorship labor system. It basically gives an employer total control over a migrant worker's residency, their job, even their ability to leave the country. It's a portable, highly adaptable technology of control.
So when you look across the map, Western Europe, the Americas, the Gulf, the outcomes are just chillingly consistent. Exclusion, disparity, and as you said, lethal health outcomes.
The global conclusion is inescapable. The consistency confirms SAR is this persistent, self-reinforcing operating system.
Which brings us to the final and I think most provocative thought the sources leave us with, this idea of defining anti-Black racism as an urgent global public health crisis.
Because it raises the question of consequence. Systemic anti-Blackness causes what's called racial trauma, race-based traumatic stress. And the material shows that this leads directly to chronic disease, to increased mortality.
So the system is actively making people sick and shortening their lives.
Globally. So if that's the case, the sources argue that incremental reform just isn't enough. The problem is structural, so the solution must be too, which is where the call for comprehensive correction, including reparations, comes from. If it's a global health crisis, you have to treat the root cause.